Chapter 6. The conference room was stunned into silence. No one moved, talked, or to break the silence which had followed the recounting of Newman's first trip outside the unit. Tabbert was the first to recover. "Well," he said slowly, "well." Patricia tilted her head curiously. "If you'd like, we have the security video of the incident." She paused, reveling in Tabbert's evident discomfort. "I could arrange for you to view it." Tabbert pretended to be making some notes. Unfortunately, he forgot to uncap his pen. "No, the reports will be sufficient." He suddenly realized his mistake and virtually tore the cap off. "Please continue." Patricia smiled sweetly. "Of course, sir." After the incident, Newman calmly walked back to the unit. He was returned to his quarters without incident. She turned to Clemente. He bit his lower lip. "We did immediate and prolonged follow-up testing as well as increased observation. We couldn't discover any change at all in his condition or demeanor from before the incident." He opened a file. "In fact, his blood pressure, pulse, respiration, all his vitals actually lowered somewhat in the hours afterward." Tabbert continued, looking down at his non-existent notes. "And we have excluded the possibility that the incident with the cat was an accident, have we?" Patricia nodded. "As I said, sir, I'd be happy for you to look at the video and reach your own conclusion." Clemente kicked her under the table. No, that won't be necessary," Tabbert said quickly. "What are your explanations for this rather unusual event?" "We have arrived at 4 possible explanations," Jack said, before Patricia could answer. He turned to the older neurologist, Dr. Kapp. The old man was very still as he spoke. "Examine the sequence of events." He paused. "A discussion of anger, its roots and outlets. The subject begins to lecture the therapist on anger avoidance. Then, as if to illustrate a point, he puts the injured bird out of its evident misery. He doesn't appear to be angry about the unprovoked attack by the cat on the bird. Rather, he acts directly, ending the bird's suffering." "And the cat?" Tabbert asked. The logical extension of his argument, the old man continued. "A second demonstration. Rather than express anger at the cat, he avenges the bird by killing the object he perceives as the proximal cause of the bird's death." He took a sip of water. "He sees himself as without anger or guilt. He is not the cause of either death. He is instead removed from both acts, when in fact his anger is actually directed at the cat for what he perceives as the cowardly attack, and the bird for allowing itself to be attacked." "Dumb," Patricia said beneath her breath. Clemente jumped in, trying to cover her obvious feelings of disdain. "Dr. Kaff's opinion has not met with universal acceptance," he said. He turned to a youngish psychologist near the other end of the table. "Dr. Mont?" The young man straightened his notes, then read from them without looking up. "It is my belief, upon reviewing the tapes and transcripts, that the subject was attempting to express his contempt for the medical establishment, a group dedicated to healing, by causing these 2 deaths. First, he allows the cat to attack the pigeon so that he has a pretext for the acts. Then he callously kills the 2 animals in an overt attempt to shock us." He closed his file, looking over at Tabbert. "Next," Tabbert said, ignoring the crestfallen young man. Jack smiled sympathetically at the young man. "My personal view is in effect a combination of the first 2 espoused theory with one minor change." A coughing fit interrupted him momentarily. "I believe his action in killing the pigeon was genuine. Most of us agree on that. The cat, on the other hand, may well have become to him the symbol of all of us who are imprisoning and studying him. In therapy, he has referred to the government as a predator out of control, much as the cat." Newman saw the imminent attack but failed to act, for reasons as yet undetermined. His inaction caused the injury to the bird that compelled him to end its suffering. Then his unresolved, unacknowledged rage at us, at the government, at society in general, which he views as universally hostile, boiled over. But his intellect recognized the threat to him if he reacted against us directly, so he selects the cat as our effigy. He paused. Even the manner of the act, trotting it underfoot, not dirtying his hands, so to speak, is evidence of his contempt for all authority. Another pause. "Now, imagine that mentality loose in society." He allowed his voice to trail off. Tabert was making copious notes now. Yet you still refuse to classify the subject as sociopathic? It's as close as anything else, but no, he's not a sociopath. All of his actions, all of his thought processes show that he has a keen awareness of future consequences, and more important, that he has been able to distinguish between those acts he can and those he cannot get away with. If he's a sociopath, he's demonstrated more self-control in those areas than I would imagine possible. Rubbish, Patricia said quietly. Tabert looked up. Excuse me, Dr. Nelwyn? I said rubbish. Might I assume, then, that yours is the fourth hypothesis? She nodded. Tabert looked at Clemente, then back to Patricia. You disagree with your superior? She took a deep breath. With all due respect to Dr. Clemente, I do. Tabert, having gone into the meeting sure that he could get rid of this odious project easily, was in a tailspin. The opinions of men like Clemente and Caff could not be ignored, young Mont's ridiculous ramblings notwithstanding, and the last thing he needed was some completely out-of-orbit hypothesis from this wild-eyed girl. And yet he was able to recognize that her relationship with Newman had been closer than any of the others. Also, beneath the hubris of the efficient Germanic administrator beat the heart of a psychiatric researcher who was beginning to become deeply intrigued by Brian Newman, and disturbed. Go ahead, Dr. Nelwyn, but he gestured for effect. Please be brief. Patricia looked at the faces in the room, all either skeptical or openly hostile, including Clemente's. She took a deep breath and began. I agree with Dr. Clemente, she said softly. Newman is not a sociopath. A socio demonstrates an inadequately developed conscience. He feels no guilt for actions that harm others, but he does feel it for those actions that cause harm to himself. I think we can agree on at least that much. She looked around the table. Even Tabert nodded agreement. But, she continued, as far as I can determine, Newman has never expressed any guilt at anything he's ever done. None. She tossed a copy of Newman's background file into the center of the long table. Read it. From early childhood on, he decides to do a thing, and he does it regardless of potential consequences. And there are definitely no indications of the man ever reacting out of rage at any time. The skeptical looks were turning into overtly contemptuous ones. To the point, please, Doctor, Tabert said as he checked his watch. She ignored the tone in his voice. She pulled the file back to her, opened it, and began to read at random. His foster parents report that he seldom cries after the age of 3. At the age of 7, he breaks a finger and calmly walks to his foster mother and tells her. At the age of 11, he falls off his bicycle, causing a gash that requires 13 stitches. He not only doesn't cry, but the ER physician notes that Newman clinically watches himself being stitched up, asking questions along the way. So he has a high pain threshold, Tabert interrupted. That doesn't mean. At 15, she continued, interrupting the chief of staff, he is found by a teacher tampering with a stoplight. His explanation is that the walk sign doesn't last long enough for him to safely cross the street. The teacher explains that his tampering could result in a horrible accident. He shrugged, saying only, but at least I'll be able to get across. And unlike a sociopath, he never objects in any way to his punishment, which in this case was quite severe. She paused. He simply did what he wanted to do, when he wanted to, understanding and accepting the consequences of the act both to society and to himself. Tabert tried again. I don't see. Newman, Patricia continued, I believe, is completely and wholly without a conscience. Based on the lack of any damage or malformations to his brain that we've been able to discover, my guess is that he was born that way. Unable to feel guilt, remorse, shame, fault, any of those things that are conscience-centered. Emotionally free to do anything he wants to do without ever feeling the slightest concern about it, either for the consequences to others or himself. Tabert, the scientist, was intrigued, barely. Cerebrochemical imbalances have been ruled out, Dr. Nelwyn, or hadn't you noticed? He shook his head. And for the type of condition you hypothesize, radical behavior changes leading to pseudo-sociopathy, one would expect to see a marked imbalance in the cerebrospinal fluid levels or pressures, no? Or at least some basic malformation of the choroid plexuses in one of the lateral ventricles of the brain. Patricia nodded as a strange smile began to spread on her otherwise intense face. Not if the synapses are functioning in a wholly new way, evolving into a state where they have no need for a neurotransmitter such as acetylcholine or evolving. Patricia looked the little man right in the eye. Evolving, she said in a steady voice, in my opinion. The question at hand, Doctor, Tabbert interrupted, involved the pigeon and the cat. Patricia remained unfazed by the change in the chief's tone. Exactly my point. With apologies to Dr. Clemente, Dr. Cafe, and Dr. Mont, I don't think Newman had any deep-seated resentments or ulterior motivations. I think he killed the pigeon in a bald-faced attempt to curry favor with us, perhaps to gain some advantage by gaining our respect, demonstrate his kindness in eliminating the animal's suffering. What about the cat? Clemente interrupted for the first time. She turned to face her friend and colleague. Newman gave us the answer he told us that day. You mean, she nodded, cats really piss him off. His exact words, and being a man without a conscience, he acted to remove the source of his irritation. The table exploded in urgent voices. Tabbert tapped the table for order, but was ignored. Finally, Clemente got the other's attention. If you're right, why has he allowed us to keep him a virtual prisoner for 3 months without incident? Why not wildly struck out at us as he allegedly did to the Russians? Surely we pissed him off more than cats. All eyes turned to Patricia. She thought for a long time before answering. Not about the answer, but about whether or not they would believe it. She began very slowly. We agree he's not a sociopath, one of the traits of which is a failure to learn from past mistakes. Hearing no objection, she went on. His IQ is well above genius, higher in fact than anyone's at this table. He has no conscience, but he does have an almost infinite ability to learn. Note the escape attempts in Russia, each more successful than the previous, stopped only by placing him in maximum isolation and threatening him with deadly force whenever they opened the door. She paused for effect, just as we've done here. She gathered her papers and closed her file. He knew he could kill the cat without consequence to his inevitable plans, so since he wanted to, he did. And what, pray tell, Tabbert said sarcastically, are his inevitable plans? Patricia took a deep breath. I think that's clear. She looked around the table for support that wasn't there. He's learned from his past mistakes, and he's learning more every day. From us, about us. And one day he will try to escape again, and when he does, he will do whatever he has to without the slightest thought or compunction in order to make the attempt successful. The table was quiet, but she knew that wouldn't last long. Her only question was who would voice the obvious thought. Tabbert cleared his throat. Dr. Nelwyn, do you believe that the subject is some kind of Ubermensch? Some form of miraculously endowed deviant who can only be stopped by a silver bullet or a stake through his heart? No. Her voice was soft but firm. He's no deviant. Then please, enlighten us. Who is he in your expert opinion? It was now or never. It is indisputable, she began slowly, that man is in a constant state of evolution. It is a given by many branches of anthropological science that our little fingers and little toes are getting smaller with every generation. It is equally accepted that they'll disappear within 1,000 years or so. Do we really need... Clemente interrupted Tabbert. Go on, he said in an intense voice. So why not our brains as well? Perhaps evolving in a slower, less obvious, but more complex way. Why can't they be evolving as well? She paused, waiting for the inevitable interruption. It didn't come. Man has always been defined by the size and functions of his brain. From Australopithecus robustus with a brain 450 to 700 cubic centimeters in volume, to Homo erectus with its brain of 700 to 1,100 cubic centimeters. Finally, to modern man, Homo sapiens, literally wise man, due to his brain of between 1,100 and 1,500 cc. But, Kapp interrupted, Newman's brain is well within that range, 1,435 cc, I believe. Patricia shrugged. We've all seen the work of Dan Dennett at the Center for Cognitive Studies at Tufts University. Bred Jared diamonds through chimpanzees. She paused, and when she spoke again, it was in a soft, slightly unsure tone. All I'm doing is carrying their work to the next logical conclusion. My gosh, Tabbert said in genuine alarm, you're not suggesting... Patricia cut him off. What if the current evolution is neurological, taking place within our brains, not an expansion of the tissues, but a reworking of its very essence? Cap stared at her. Do you realize what you are saying? His voice was quiet and shaky. Man has remained essentially unchanged for well over 300,000 years. She nodded slowly, ignoring the looks from around the table. Australopithecus robustus lived for 200,000 years before the first Homo erectus showed up. Erectus was unchallenged for another 200,000. Then Homo sapiens arrived on the scene. We've had longer runs than either of them. We're due. She paused. Overdue, actually. Shouts of disbelief, anger, and confusion mixed with the sound of Tabert hammering on the table for order. Only Clemente, Cap, and Patricia remained silent, looking into each other's eyes deeply. The noise subsided. Dr. Nelwyn, Tabert spit out, I strongly advise you not to express those absurd, imbecilic, unscientific. He seemed to want to find yet another word to beat her down with. Failing that, he shook his head. This meeting is over. I will meet individually with those of you I need prior to tomorrow's review. He stood up. Dr. Nelwyn? She looked over at him. Dr. Nelwyn, if you mention any of these completely crazed notions of yours outside of this room, I will personally see to it that you are not only severed from this institution, but will never work in the mental health field again. He followed the group toward the door. I recommend that you immediately re-enter therapy and examine exactly what your motivations are. For that reason, you are hereby granted an immediate indefinite leave of absence. He stood in the doorway, a new man indeed. He stormed out. Patricia had closed her eyes as the anger, insult, and humiliation had been heaped on her by her departing colleagues. When she opened them again, the room was empty except for Jack Clemente and Dr. Caff. You really believe that, don't you? Clemente said. She nodded sadly. Yes. Why? It's me, Jack. Just tell me simply and without ego, why? She looked into his eyes and glimpsed something. Disappointment in her, maybe. We're in the business, she said with a cry in her voice, of defining the indefinable, explaining the mysteries and perplexities of thoughts, emotions, actions in an accepted way, using an accepted vocabulary. She turned to him, reaching out, taking his hand in hers. You, said Newman, something we've never seen before, something that defies any conventional explanation. A previously undiagnosed mental disorder. Why? She stood up and began pacing. Even Freud said sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Why ignore an obvious possibility just because it comes from left field? Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, and sometimes something new is something new. Jack looked at her, stood, shaking his head sadly. I don't know, he said so softly she had to strain to hear him. He coughed briefly and seemed to slump. I have to think about it. He turned and slowly walked from the room. Dr. Nelwyn? She whirled around, having forgotten that Cap was still in the room. What do you want now? She asked in a defeated voice. Hell, she thought, if Jack won't believe me. Dr. Nelwyn, the old man said in a reasonable voice, I do not believe your theory is correct. Great, she spat out. However, he walked over, putting his hand on her shoulder. I may be wrong. What? The sun does not circle a flat earth. Today's scientific fact is often tomorrow's unbelievably preposterous history. He patted her on the shoulder. Man is an evolving creature. One day, the next age will begin. We will turn around to see an unfamiliar face or form, and we will shrink back from it in abject fear, as we did today. He gathered his files and started for the door. Halfway there, he stopped, turning back to her. It is my hope, no, it is my prayer that this unfamiliar face or form will not be our Mr. Newman. A future of Homo sapiens confronted with Homo crudelis is a dark future indeed, he laughed. At least for those of us Homo sapiens. Guten Nacht, Madam Doctor. Patricia watched his retreating form, completely taken up by his imagery, her mind racing to comprehend the basic truth of the old man's words, and struggling to comprehend that one most basic truth that he had voiced. Homo sapiens against Homo crudelis, wise man in an inevitably losing struggle against his predestined replacement. Homo crudelis, cold-hearted man, free of all the restraints on behavior that we take for granted today. A hunter-killer with the intellect of modern man, capable of anything and everything. Cap is right, she thought as she walked out of the conference room. There is only one possible outcome. In the unit, Edel was also preparing for the next day's review. So, he said to his senior supervisors, where does all of this planning leave us, huh? One of his lieutenants sipped some coffee. The review board is scheduled to arrive at 0800, the man began. That means the earliest they would want to see him, if Dr. Clemente's information is correct, would be 10:30 to 11. Another man chimed in. When he believes they are within a half hour of the time, Dr. Clemente will signal us at the nurse's station. We will then commence the movement. Edel nodded. I will personally escort the patient in the elevator. He paused as he wiped his eyes. I want 2 men in the antechamber, 3 by the nurse's station for emergency, and 5 on the office floor. They all nodded. Relax, Conrad, the first lieutenant said. We've taken care of everything. Relax, get some sleep. Edel looked at the men and smiled. Yeah. He stood stretched and head over the elevator. Once inside, he hesitated before pushing the button. He should go home. He was bone tired. The increased security since the trip outside had been a strain on Edel and his staff. Now with this dog and pony show tomorrow, he made up his mind. Home and sleep would have to wait. He pressed the button for the sub-basement. He waved the guards back to their seats as he walked over to the monitor. He saw Newman sitting on the couch watching a movie. He picked up a microphone. Mr. Newman, it is Conrad Edel, sir. Newman looked up at the camera. How are you, Harry Edel? I'm very well, sir. I was wondering, since you are still up, would you like to talk for a time? Newman smiled. That would be nice. A few minutes later, the door was closed and locked behind the security chief. He walked over and shook Newman's hand. I apologize for not coming by lately. Things have been most busy. Newman laughed lightly, and I apologize if I've caused you any extra work. Edel waved it away. It is not you, it is the bureaucrats and doctors. They can be difficult. Indeed. A silence settled over them for a moment. So, how do things go with you? Edel asked. Are you wanting for anything? They sat down next to each other on the couch, the picture of 2 old friends having a pleasant visit. They see to it that things go very much the same with me, Newman said, and thanks to your kindness, I lack for nothing that matters. He gestured at a Bible that sat on the coffee table. It was nothing. Edel picked up the Bible, turning to the place marked by the thin red ribbon. Isaiah? Newman recited the quotation easily. Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that her warfare is ended, that her iniquity is pardoned, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. Edel nodded gravely. You despair of your government's wrath? I do. Edel turned a few pages. You mustn't, he said as he searched for the passage. You must put yourself in God's loving hands and count on his kindness, forgiveness, and everlasting love. Newman seemed to be listening intently. I understand that intellectually, he began in a hesitant voice, but there is so much to forgive. A long pause during which his breathing quickened, perhaps even more than for God's taste, he said as he looked down. Edel put his arm around the seemingly desolate man as he continued to turn pages. Have faith, Brian, he suddenly brightened, handing the Bible to Newman from verse 16. Newman scanned down the page, then began to read. Turn thou to me and be gracious to me, for I am lonely and afflicted. Relieve the troubles of my heart and bring me out of my distresses. Consider my affliction and my trouble and forgive all my sins. A tear hung on the corner of his eye as he finished. Thank you, he said in a choked voice. For the next 45 minutes they read the Bible, exchanged their interpretations, and prayed together. Finally, Edel stood to leave. Take heart, Brian, the security chief said as Newman wiped his eyes. The Lord is watching over you, and the Lord will protect you. Amen, Newman said, and as the door opened, quickly calculated his options. The door is open. Only Edel and the 2 guards beyond. 15 seconds tops. Get Edel's elevator key. Open the doors. Push the button. Doors close. Elevator rises to the desired floor. 45 seconds. 3 to 5 guards, confused, still reacting to my initial move. With luck and a favorable break or 2, 30 seconds. 1 minute, 30 seconds from the quarters door to the front door of the unit. 1 minute, 30 seconds, and 6 to 8 armed individuals, not counting night nurses or orderlies that might be foolish enough to interfere. Probability of success, 50-50. Newman took a step toward Edel. "Good night, my friend." Edel turned and smiled, unaware of how close he had come to testing the existence of heaven. "Good night, Brian. I will continue praying for your release." And the door was closed and locked moments after he left. Newman turned and walked into the bathroom. He pointed at the toilet, waiting for the camera and microphones to be turned off. When he was sure, he put the lid down and stepped onto it. Humming to himself, he continued his work of the last 3 months, fingers reaching, probing, pulling around the circulation fan immediately above. For no longer than 2 minutes at a time, 3 or 4 times a day, he would work slowly, carefully. Because where there was a fan, reasonably, there was an air duct, maybe the air duct, the one that supplied the full quarters. And where there was a duct, there was a possibility of freedom. When he felt sufficient time had elapsed, he quickly returned things to how they'd been, flushed the toilet, washed his hands, and walked back out to the living room. The psychiatric social worker on duty upstairs pushed the camera in closer as Newman sat down on the couch and opened the Bible. He turned up the gain on the ambient microphones to hear what Newman seemed to be reciting. Consider how many are my foes, and with what violent hatred they hate me," he recited. "O guard my life and deliver me." It was well after 1 when Newman finally retired for the night. The unit went on late observation status while the maintenance crew began its nightly regime of cleaning and polishing. Things settled into their usual quiet overnight rhythms. On the 3-block stretch of the Sigersunstrasse on the edge of Munich, known locally as the Devil's Playground, the exact opposite was happening. It was noise, neon, cars, and bodies. The garish lights gave everything a reddish-blue tinge. The hard-driving rock music, 8 different songs blaring from 20 or so speakers at the same time, assaulted the passing bodies as well as their ears. And the smell of sex was everywhere. The cars moved slowly through the narrow streets, forced by the congestion and the gawking to a crawl. Their radios and exhaust fumes added their bits to the cacophony and the madness. It would all continue until just before dawn. There were 3 types of visitors to the Devil's Playground, and each had their unofficially assigned parts of the night. The tourists, eager to see the decadence, the excitement, the wickedness, usually arrived just after 8. Almost always staying in their cars, they would drive up and down the playground, pointing and leering, living vicariously off the sights, sounds, and imagined debauchery of the place. But they were mostly gone by midnight. Then the users arrived. The first taxis would begin arriving between midnight and 1 a.m. Their passengers would be dropped off either at the edges of the playground or at the doors to the private clubs. They would stay for a few minutes or hours, always returning to the waiting cabs, ready to whisk them away to the clean world, secretly reliving their night of sinfulness over and over until they would again return. But it was after 3 in the morning and those few hours before sunlight that the important clientele would arrive. The stretched silver or black limousines patiently waited their turns to pull up to the back doors of the private clubs. The passengers, wealthy and powerful men, sought twisted evil pleasures for which they would pay handsomely. It was largely to these last visitors of the night that the Devil's Playground was dedicated. Anything they wanted, anything they could imagine, legalities and the church be damned, was provided. If they paid the price, of course, and they always did. The man stood across the street from the start of the playground, smoking a cigarette that was more butt than anything else. He looked out at the chaos, the bedlam, felt the sounds, and sniffed the gentle scent of coitus floating around, mingling with the acrid fumes. He took a deep drag of his cigarette, the glowing end drawing back to his fingers, burning them, adding the smell of charred flesh to the others of the night. But he didn't move. He took another drag, and the butt extinguished itself against his fingers. He casually threw the remnants away, then pulled out and lit another. Raising his collar against the fall mist and possible identification, he crossed the street. Most of the tourists were gone. The street, still backed up but thinning quickly, was adjusting, pausing, waiting for the next wave to begin. The girl, still relatively fresh and energized, called out to him in German as he passed. "Hey, baby. I got what you want, big man. Anything, sweetie, for you. I got health certificates. We have good time, little boy." He ignored them all. The girls in the short skirts that didn't cover the spread legs, the see-through or open blouses, the touches and gropes, which were all part of the journey down Sigerson. He crossed the street in the middle, ignoring the young preteen boys in their skin-tight jeans and mesh tank tops, the older boys in their leathers, the he-shes, the transvestites, the pathetically aged 20-year-olds lingering in the hotel doorways. The club started on the next block. The music wasn't quite as loud there. The whores on the street seemed cleaner and less aggressive. Instead, doormen urged him in to see the best show in the city, or the show that goes so far I cannot even tell you about it, or we request you inform the management if you have a heart condition. Our show is considered dangerous to any that do. The man walked past them all, not even giving them a sideways glance. He crossed to the final block of the playground. Here, the sidewalks were almost deserted. The doormen, dressed in full livery, nodded or doffed their caps as he passed. It was cleaner, quieter, and somehow more foreboding. He stopped at number 37, climbed the 5 steps as the doorman wordlessly opened the door for him. The lobby was elegantly and richly furnished. Fine parquet flooring was covered by a thick Isfahan carpet in deep black and gold. Damask covered the walls also in a gold and black pattern. The deep red French provincial couch with its mahogany borders fit perfectly with the mahogany counter at the far end. He walked up to the conservatively dressed older man behind the counter. "I'm Ghislaine. How may I help you, please?" the counterman said in German. The man handed across a membership card. Ghislaine pulled out a laptop computer and punched in the code. A moment later, he nodded as he handed back the card. Now he spoke in English. "You are most welcome here, sir. May I take your coat?" The man handed across his top coat and scarf. Ghislaine disappeared into a back room with them, returning a minute later with the pale blue card. "May I take your order, sir?" The man reached out, took the card, and began to run his finger down it. He stopped, pointing out several of the items listed. He handed back the card. Ghislaine nodded and smiled a professional smile. "Very discerning, sir. In the Lyceum, sir?" "Not tonight," the man said softly. "Perhaps then the salons?" The man nodded. Ghislaine placed the card in a canister, which he dropped into a tube. He pressed a button, causing a door to the left of the counter to open noiselessly. As the man started for the door, Ghislaine called after him. "It is nice to have you with us again, sir. It has been too long." The man closed the door behind him. Upstairs above the club, the supervisor pulled the tube from the pneumatic conveyance. She opened it, pulling out the pale blue card. She turned to the other women sitting in the room. Blonde, 35 to 40, professional type, middle class, arrogant, shy, proper English speaking. She looked over the women. "Isa, Salon 24. A short blonde woman wearing only bikini panties and a demi-bra stood up, then walked over to a clothes rack in a bureau. The supervisor handed her the blue card as the girl took off her lingerie, replacing them with the black lacy versions of the same. She read the card, then selected a conservative ankle-length skirt and utilitarian sports blouse. She pulled her hair straight back, tying it with a piece of red yarn. The supervisor handed her a small cameo to put over the top button of her blouse as she headed out the door. 2 minutes later, standing outside the door to Salon 24, she took a deep breath and knocked. "Come in," a deep voice said. She smiled simply. "Hello, you asked to see me?" Her voice was friendly but businesslike. The man kept his back to her. "I think I need some help, doctor." Isa walked over to a desk and pulled out a pad and pen. She walked over and sat down on a divan. "Tell me all about it," she said professionally. The man leaned on a dresser, still with his back to her. "I get these feelings, urges." His voice was growing hoarse. "Sometimes I think I'm going to explode if I don't." Isa smiled and patted the divan beside her. "Why don't you come and sit down beside me? We will talk about it." The man slowly turned, walking over to her. He hesitated, but she smiled encouragingly. He sat down. Isa quickly evaluated the man. He was strong, very fit, but certainly over 50, with dark circles under his eyes. She decided how far she would go with him, then continued. How may I help you? She said as she pretended to take notes. I feel things, the man said softly, hear things that make me want to do things. Issa felt him move closer to her, his leg brushing against hers. She moved a little bit away. What kind of things is it that these feelings make you want to do? Ugly things, he said as he pressed up against her again. Horribly ugly things. Things I know I can get away with that others can't. He put his hand on her leg, slowly rubbing it while he began to pull up her skirt. Issa squirmed uncomfortably. Please, sir, this is not appropriate behavior. He reached up and began fondling her breast. She tried to pull away from him, but he forced her back, powerful, calloused hands pinning her to the divan as he continued. I can do anything, he muttered hoarsely, anything. The rules don't apply to me. He tore open her blouse. She tried to push him off her, but received the back of his hand for her troubles. You little bitch. He pulled her from the divan and threw her to the thickly carpeted floor. Pulling her skirt up to her waist, he roughly groped her between her legs while savagely biting at her breasts. He suddenly straightened, his expression animalistic, and tore her clothes off, quickly reducing them to rags. Issa, her face a picture of fear, measured the man, hoping she wouldn't have to give the emergency signal to the bodyguard outside the door. Please stop, she begged. Don't. Why me? She allowed tears to fill her eyes while she continued to measure the man's responses. He straightened up again. Shut up. Why not you? I can do anything, have anything. You can't stop me. No one can. He bent down again, roughly grabbing her legs and lifting them around his shoulders. You will do whatever I tell you to do, won't you? His voice was thick with violence as he entered her. I will do whatever you want, Issa groaned out. As his eyes glazed over, as he gasped for breath, he spoke again, this time in a vicious whisper. Then, call me Newman.